Hello everyone and welcome to the biology lecture series, and today we'll be discussing the topic control and coordination. So in the previous lectures we have discussed about the control and coordination in the plants, where we studied about the movement in the plants. Then we studied about the types of the stimulus, and we also studied about the various phytohormones and their functions. Then we studied about the coordination in the animals. Okay, we also studied about the nervous system of the animals, as well as the hydra and the grasshopper. All right. In the previous lecture, we were discussing about the nervous system in the humans. So we were talking about the types of the nervous system. Okay, and we were discussing about the central nervous system. So this lecture is the continuation of the previous lecture. All right. So in the previous lecture, we were studying about the types of the nervous system. So there are there are two types of the nervous system, or what are the two components of the nervous system? They are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So these are the main components of the nervous system. But there is one more nervous system known as the autonomous nervous system. Okay, which you can say is a part of the peripheral nervous system only. So we have completed the central nervous system, and in this lecture we will be talking about the peripheral nervous system. So peripheral nervous system, it includes the cranial nerves as well as the spinal nerves. Now, so cranial nerves, they are related to the brain, and the spinal nerves, they are related to the spinal cord. Okay, now this peripheral nervous system, it mainly controls the voluntary activities of the body. The voluntary activity means that are under our control. So activities can be voluntary or involuntary. So involuntary activities includes like vomiting, hunger. These are all involuntary activities. Now first let's talk about the cranial nerves. So cranial nerves, they are also known as the cerebral nerves, and they arise from the brain. So this cranial word, it is related to the brain, as well as the cerebral word, this is also related to the brain. Now there are 12 pairs of the cranial nerves in man, and 31 pairs of spinal nerves that arise from the spinal cord. So I've told you cranial nerves, they arise from the brain, whereas the spinal nerves, they arise from the spinal cord. Now the third one is the autonomous or the autonomic nervous system. Now, this nervous system, it controls the involuntary activities. Okay, so involuntary activities of the internal organs such as the hair, blood vessels, the activity of the glands, and the smooth muscles of the alimentary canal as well as the uterus. These are all controlled by the autonomous nervous system. So this autonomous nervous system, which is involved in the control or the regulation of the involuntary activities. These are further divided into sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic nervous system. So these are all involuntary activities. Hearing, the blood vessels, okay, the release of hormones by the glands, or the release of any kind of secretion by the glands, and the contraction or the relaxation of the smooth muscles which are present in the alimentary canal. All right. So these are all controlled by the autonomous nervous system. Now let's discuss about the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic nervous system. Now the organs, they receive the nerves from both sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic nerve fibers. Now the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic nerve fibers, they have opposite effects on the organs. Okay, one is stimulatory and the other one is inhibitory. So you can say both of them they have antagonistic role. Okay, they have antagonistic or they have opposite functions. Now, let's study about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. What are the effects on the different organs? So in this table, I've listed the organ and what is the role of the sympathetic, or you can say effect of the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic nervous system on the organ. So let's talk about heart. So the sympathetic nervous system, it increases the heart rate, whereas the parasympathetic system, it decreases the heart rate. So you can see one is stimulating, okay, one acts as a stimulatory and the other acts as a inhibitory. Okay, so both of these, they have antagonistic role or opposite role. Now if we talk about the blood vessels, so these sympathetic system will, it helps in the constricting of the arteries and it raises the blood pressure. Okay, so this is known as vasoconstriction or the constriction of the blood vessels. So whenever the arteries, they constrict, so what will happen there? Lumen will be quite narrow, and because of this the blood pressure will rise. Okay, so you can say this is a kind of vasoconstriction, and this will increase the blood pressure. Now what is the effect of parasympathetic system? So it will dilate the arteries and which will lower the blood pressure. Clear? Now let's talk about the bronchi. So bronchi, you know, when we were studying about the respiratory system, there are two bronchi, left bronchi as well as the right bronchi, and these bronchi, they enter into the lungs and they further divide into bronchioles. Now what is the effect of sympathetic system? It dilates the bronchi, making the breathing easier, and parasympathetic system, what it will do, it will constrict the bronchi. Now let's talk about the eye. So it will dilate the pupil, whereas the parasympathetic system, it will constrict the pupil. Clear? So when your eye pupil will be dilated, whenever there is a condition of fear of flight, all right, then your pupils will be dilated. Now next are the gastric secretion. So gastric secretion, they takes place in the stomach, where the gastric juice is secreted by the tissues or the cells present in the stomach. Now sympathetic system, it will inhibit the secretion, all right, and the parasympathetic system, it will stimulate the secretion. So these secretions, they takes place whenever the food enters there. So because of this secretion, the food gets digested. Okay, salivary glands. So these are the glands present in the buccal cavity. And if we talk about the humans, there are three pairs of the salivary glands. Okay, so sympathetic system, it inhibits the secretion of the saliva, whereas parasympathetic, it stimulates the secretion of the saliva. Now urinary bladder, it relaxes the urinary bladder, sympathetic system, whereas the parasympathetic system, it will contract the urinary bladder. Clear? So you can clearly see one of the system has the inhibitory effect and the other system has the stimulating effect. Clear? So because of this, a balance is maintained. Now if we talk about the liver, so liver produces what? Liver is involved in the production of the bile. Okay, and what are the components of the bile? Some bile pigments are present, such as bilirubin and biliverdin, and some salts are present in the bile, but there are no enzymes. Clear? So sympathetic system, it will reduce the bile secretion, whereas the parasympathetic, it promotes the bile secretion. And bile is secreted whenever the food is present. All right, clear? Now let's talk about the reflex action. So about this also I've talked briefly in the previous lectures as well. So here you can see the spinal cord, which is the part of what? Central nervous system. And here we have the receptors. Okay, so these receptors, these are present where? These can be present in the skin. Okay, or you can say they are present in the body surface. All right, this is clear. Now these receptors, example can be the pain receptors, which are present in the body surface or on the body surface or just beneath the skin. So these receptors, what is the role of these receptors? They sense the stimuli. Okay, that's why they are known as the sensory receptors also. So what is the role? They will sense the external stimulus. External stimulus can be of lot of types. So earlier I have shown you one kind of stimulus can be whenever your hands or the fingers, they touch the hot object. So that is a kind of stimulus. And then what happens? The sensory neurons. So we have already discussed neurons are of basically two types, sensory as well as the motor neurons. And another one is the interneuron that connects the sensory and the motor neuron. So these sensory neurons, what is their function? They will carry the stimulus towards the spinal cord. Okay, so the stimulus is transferred from the sensory neurons towards the spinal cord, and in the spinal cord, what happens? The response is generated. Okay, so this stimulus, it is processed in the spinal cord. Clear? So we can say the stimulus or the information. Stimulus, okay, or you can say the information. This is processed in the spinal cord. Clear? And when this stimulus is processed, then a response is generated. And this response, this is carried by the motor neuron. So what is the role of the motor neuron? This motor neuron will carry the motor information from the spinal cord towards the effector organ. So you can draw arrows like this. Here, the stimulus is being transferred to the spinal cord, and here the processing of the stimulus will be done. And then what is happening here? The response that is generated is carried by the motor neurons towards the effector organs such as muscles. So muscles are the type of effector organs. Okay, clear? One more example of effector organs are glands. So these glands will be stimulated and they will secrete. Okay, they will secrete their secretions. Okay, or they will get stimulated and then they will secrete enzymes or some gastric juice or hormones. Okay, so what is the role of the motor neuron? It carries the response, you can say, or the motor information. It carries the motor information from what? From the spinal cord to the effector. Clear? So this is known as the reflex action. Also, you can say this is a reflex arc. Clear? So here, whenever the effector organs such as muscles, they will receive the information, or then a response will be generated. Okay, and then you will remove the hand from the hot object. Now this is the TS of the spinal cord. Okay, and the arrows, they show the reflex arc. So you can see this is the central nervous system, which consists of the spinal cord as well as the brain. Okay, here is the white matter and the gray matter is also present here. Clear? So here you can see this is the spinal cord. So here you can see this fissure. Okay, these are fissure. One is dorsal median fissure, another one is ventral median fissure. So I have already told you what is the role of the fissure. These fissure, they divide the brain or the spinal cord into equal halves, or they divide the brain or this spinal cord into these equal hemispheres. Okay. Now here you can see This is the sensory neuron. Okay, spinal nerves, we'll talk about spinal nerves also, which arise from the spinal cord. So here what is happening? This is the receptor which are present in the skin. Okay, and what is the role of this receptor? What they do, they sense the stimulus. Okay, so here is the stimuli, and these arrows you can see. Okay, they carry the stimulus to the spinal cord, and then what happens? A response. This information is, or the stimulus is processed here, and then what happens? You can see here. Again, with the help of the motor neuron, the signals are sent to the effector muscles. Clear? So sensory neuron is also known as the afferent neuron. This also I have already told you. And the other one, so this one should be the, so if this is the sensory neuron, so this one should be motor neuron. Okay, so we can label it like this. So this one is the motor neuron, that is bringing the motor information, or you can say that is bringing the information from the spinal cord towards the effector organ, which is muscles here. Clear? Now, spinal nerves, how can we define spinal nerves? So the spinal nerves, they interact directly with the spinal cord, regulating both motor as well as the sensory signals from the body's periphery. Clear? These are known as the spinal nerves. So we have already talked about these nerves. One is the motor nerve, another one is the sensory nerve. Now, what are dorsal and the ventral fissures? So in this previous image, we can see the dorsal median fissure as well as the ventral median fissure. So these are nothing but these are deep grooves that separate the spinal cord into two equal hemispheres. Okay, into two halves also you can say. And there another kind of fissure known as the cerebral fissure. Okay, what are the cerebral fissures? The cerebral fissure, these divides the brain, okay, into two equal halves. This divide the brain into, you can say, hemisphere, into hemispheres. Okay, the cerebral term is related to brain only. Okay, so cerebral fissure will divide the brain into these lobes or hemisphere, and the dorsal and the ventral fissure, these are deep grooves that separate the spinal cord into two equal halves. Okay, so now you know about the reflex action and the reflex arc. Clear? Now the reflex action, okay, it is the name given to the response which is at the level of the spinal cord itself. Now, it is a rapid automatic response. How can we define reflex action? It is a rapid automatic response to a stimulus by an organ or a system of organs which does not involve the brain for its initiation. Now, a reflex action is an unconscious means without your will. Okay, and is involuntary response of the effector. Examples of effector can be muscles of the gland to a stimulus. This is known as the reflex action. So it is an involuntary response which is not under our control. Clear? Now reflexes, they are of two types. First is the simple or unconditional reflex. First one is the simple reflex, another one is the unconditional and continuous reflexes. So let's first talk about the simple reflex. So it is an inborn response to a stimulus. What is happening here? Learning is not required, and these are mostly protective in function. For example, knee jerk occurred immediately when the patella tendon of the leg is sharply taped, quickly closing of the eyelid when an object suddenly comes in front of you. Okay, this is known as the corneal reflex. These are the examples of the simple reflex. One is the knee jerk. Okay, and other one is the closing of the eyelid whenever any object suddenly comes in front of you. okay, which is known as the corneal reflex. So this comes under the simple reflex, and they are also known as the inborn response to the stimulus. Clear? It happens suddenly. Another one are the conditional reflex. So these are not inborn. Here what is happening? They are acquired by the experience, training as well as learning. Clear? For example, learning of cycling or driving of a scooter. So these are known as the conditional reflexes. Means they are acquired. Okay, we learn about it. That's why the name is given acquired. And it comes with the experience. So you remember. Okay, you learn about these. So these are known as the conditional reflexes. Clear? Now let's talk about the electroencephalogram, also known as the EEG. So what is EEG? It is an instrument called the electroencephalogram, which can record the electrical activities of the brain. Okay, so one instrument was ECG. Okay, ECG was electrocardiograph, which record the electrical impulses of the heart. And here there is one more instrument known as electroencephalogram, which is an instrument that record the electrical activity of the brain. Okay, so the nerve impulses, they are nothing but these are the electrical impulses. So when we were talking about the nerve impulses, okay, these nerve impulses are nothing but these are the electrical impulses. Okay, so these impulses, these can be recorded, okay, by an instrument known as electroencephalogram. Now, the activity of the brain is recorded as the electrical potentials, and such a record is called as electroencephalogram. Now, by placing two electrodes on the scalp and leading via suitable amplifier to ink writing devices, record of 4 different types of waves is obtained. Okay, now these waves are named as alpha, beta, delta and the theta, and they vary in the frequency. Now these waves, they give the characteristic activity of the brain, okay, which is very useful for the clinical purposes. So if these waves follow the normal pattern, then we can say everything is fine with the brain. But if there is some changes in these waves, then we can say there is some abnormal activity going on within the brain. So electroencephalogram means EEG. This is an instrument which records the electrical signals that are generated within the brain. Okay, and these electrical impulses, these can be depicted by these waves alpha, beta, delta and theta. Alright, this is clear. So what we studied in lecture? In this lecture we studied about the reflex arc as well as the reflex action, and we also studied about the peripheral nervous system as well as the autonomous nervous system. So autonomous nervous system, it consists of the sympathetic nervous system as well as the parasympathetic nervous system. So one of the system is stimulatory and the other system is inhibitory. So we saw the effect of parasympathetic as well as the sympathetic nervous system on different organs. Okay, so one was stimulating, one was inhibiting. Then we studied about the reflex action and the reflex arc. Okay, so there we discussed, if we want to write in short what is reflex action. So first of all, reflex action, it is an involuntary action. Okay, it is involuntary and it is very rapid also. First of all, these are the two characteristics of the reflex action and how it takes place. So first we have the sensory, or you can say it starts with the receptors. So these are the receptors. Okay, so these receptors, this will sense the stimulus. This will sense the stimulus and then it will send this stimulus through through sensory neuron, also known as the effector neuron. Okay, it will send this stimulus through the sensory neuron towards the, you can say, spinal cord. And here what happens? From the spinal cord, another neuron known as the motor neuron. Okay, so motor neuron is also known as the effector neuron. Okay, so it will carry the information from the spinal cord towards the effector. Here is the effector organ, such as muscles or the glands. Okay, this is clear. So you can draw it like here. Sensory neurons, they are also known as the afferent neurons. Clear? And this is the spinal cord here. Alright, so sensory neuron will enter here in the spinal cord, and the motor neuron will originate from the spinal cord and it moves towards the effector organ. And here there is another neuron which connects these two. Okay, so this neuron, this connects these two, sensory neuron and the effector neuron, and this is known as the interneuron. Okay, this is clear. So this is connecting these two. So this purple color region, this denotes the interneuron. This is clear. So this is the reflex action, or this is how reflex action takes place, and you can say this is, you can call this as reflex arc also. Clear? Here it will, receptors will receive the stimulus, and receptors are present where? They are present in the skin, or you can say on the body surface. Clear? And what is the role? They sense the stimulus. Now this is clear. So this was the end of this session. We'll discuss about rest of the topics, and we'll also solve some of the questions related to these topics in the next session. Thank you very much for listening.